Now, to those of you who know me, it's no secret that I am a huge Genesis fan. They are without a doubt my favourite band of all time. I've seen them live on the last Domino tour, I've seen tribute bands perform early Genesis material, and I've even performed covers of Genesis music both live and here on YouTube. And like with all great artists, their history is an absolute rich tapestry with so many little subsections and different eras and offshoots, full of various characters in and around the band, such as managers and friends and fans who helped make them one of the best-selling bands of all time. So for those of you who don't know, Genesis was officially formed in 1967 and produced 2 albums, 1969's From Genesis to Revelation and the incredible Trespass, before founding member and guitarist Anthony Phillips, a man who Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford have all described as the real driving force of the group in the early days, decided to leave the band due to personal reasons. This led the remaining band members, after much searching, to find and recruit Phil Collins and Steve Hackett, and thus the definitive lineup of the Peter Gabriel era of Genesis was formed, and they went on to create Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound and The Lamb. But what if I told you that this wasn't quite true, and that there was another man who joined the group, who played many gigs with the band, he appeared with the band on their first ever television appearance, and even was instrumental in shaping one of the band's all-time best songs, and yet who is hardly ever mentioned in the history of the band, except for a couple of times offhand in rare and often forgotten interviews from out-of-print magazines from the 70s and 80s, and who there is not one single photograph of or audio recording of him in the band. Who is this mysterious character, and what role did he play in shaping the sound of early Genesis? In this video, we'll explore the mysterious circumstances around his stint in the band at perhaps the most important point in the group's entire history. This is the search for the lost Genesis member. So first, let's set the scene. The year is 1970, and a young Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Anthony Phillips, Mike Rutherford, and John Mayhew have just released their wonderful, folk-heavy prog masterpiece, Trespass. This was the first Genesis album to be put out on the label Charisma Records, who the band had recently signed to, and it was the second overall Genesis album, the first one where the band really started to explore prog and really started to find the classic Genesis sound. Anthony Phillips, however, after experiencing much difficulty performing live and amongst other sort of personal reasons, he decided he was going to leave the band, which made Genesis contemplate sort of disbanding altogether permanently, because they thought, how can we carry on without Anthony Phillips? But thanks to the encouragement of friend and tour manager Richard McPhail, they decided they would continue and go on tour to promote their brand new album Trespass and to work towards recording a new album. The band also decided they needed a new drummer because although John Mayhew was a good professional musician, he really struggled to come up with his own drum parts, and the band often had to delegate parts to him, and they wanted someone with a real sense of rhythm to drive the band forward. So they recruited the now legendary Phil Collins, played a few shows as a 4-piece band before stumbling upon a young Steve Hackett. And then the rest is history. That's the classic lineup of Genesis. Well, not exactly. As the period just after Phil Collins joins and before Steve Hackett enters the picture is where our mystery lost member fits into the puzzle. After the recruiting of Phil Collins, the band really struggled to find a guitarist until our mysterious lost member enters the scene. The man in question is Mick Barnard, a young 22-year-old guitarist who at that point was most famous for playing in a band called The Farm, and whose booking agent, David Stopps, told Mick that the then very hot Genesis were looking for a new guitarist. So for a long time this was really all the information we had about how Mick Barnard joined the band, and we knew 2 other tiny facts which I'll get to later on, but for the longest time all we had to go on was a very brief, 3-sentence Wikipedia page and a 10-second name drop from Tony Banks and Anthony Phillips in a few sort of obscure offhand sort of interviews, usually not giving more than 1 sentence to Barnard. There was only 1 photograph of him online, and it was the only one posted about, and he would often get name dropped on forums with next to no detail whatsoever, or no references, or nothing concrete that we could click on to learn about Mick Barnard. But why is such an interesting and integral part of the band's history proved to be so obscure and elusive? I researched aimlessly trying to find any tiny scraps of information about Mick Barnard until I stumbled across a 2007 interview on a site called worldofgenesis.com with Genesis biographer Robin Platts, who at the time was promoting his book celebrating the 40th anniversary of Genesis, titled Genesis Behind the Lines 1967 to 2007. In it, the interviewer brought up that Robin was able to track down and interview the elusive Mick Barnard for the book for his only ever interview, and learned a great deal about Genesis from him, with Robin even commenting that Mick is quite unfairly overlooked in the history of the band. From there I searched online until I found a relatively cheap copy, and I bought it, eagerly awaiting to get the inside scoop from our lost member Mick Barnard. The interview in the book is absolutely excellent, and I was overjoyed to read it and to learn everything about our mystery man and his time in the group. So, after his booking agent or whatever had told him that Genesis needed a guitarist, Mick went to see Genesis live as a four-piece at the British Legion Hall in Prince's Risborough in mid-1970. I mean, the details are a tiny bit sketchy because it was such a long time ago, but we assume it was around mid-1970. And he was immediately impressed with how dynamic they were as a band. He then, after meeting them and introducing himself, drove on down to Mike Rutherford's father's house in his little Mini before they all sat together and chatted, and they swapped their kind of favourite songs and their inspirations for creating music. After this, Mick started playing his guitar, initially just to Mike, before Mike persuaded him to play in front of the others. Mick himself in this interview admits that at the time he wasn't sure he'd even last in the group, but he decided to get in and have a go. He was then given a copy of Trespass and told to learn it before rehearsals began. Mick found some of the material very challenging, and in the interview states, "I was still learning guitar at the time, basically, and it was quite a struggle. Some of the numbers they were doing I found quite difficult. They had a specific technique, and that was a lot of open string playing. There were a lot of open chords with sort of single notes to make the chords up, and things like that." Perhaps the biggest issue Mick faced, however, was that he did not own a 12-string acoustic guitar, which is the integral part of the band's early sound, and he had no intention of ever playing one or getting one. Mick also disliked how regimented the band was, and that there was no moving from the arrangement. What was written and what was told was what was played. And apart from on new material, he was just told to copy Anthony Phillips' parts note for note. Mick's onstage debut with the band is also the feature of some dispute among records and forums, and various dates seem to clash, but we do know it was either in October or November 1970. And sadly, no photographs or audio recordings seem to exist or have been preserved from any of these gigs, which is perhaps the biggest reason why Mick Barnard's tenure is so often forgotten. Although the band did play some big shows at this point, including several spots at the famous Marquee Club, and Mick played around 30 shows with the band during his tenure. Perhaps the most important event that happened during Barnard's tenure was the band's first ever television appearance on a BBC show called Disco 2, which was kind of like an early version of the Old Grey Whistle Test, and sadly, the band performed a few songs on there, but the tapes of the particular show Genesis were on are lost. They were wiped, and so is any audio or photographs of the event, which is a huge tragedy. In today's day and age, it seems so odd that not even one photograph or brief audio clip of Genesis with Barnard with the band exists, particularly considering the weight that Genesis, the name, carries with it today, the stadium-selling band. But at the time, they were still just relative nobodies in the music industry. And although they had garnered a reasonable fan base with Trespass and played great, important shows supporting the album, they were nowhere near a big enough name to warrant being filmed or recorded, barring that BBC show. Now we come to Barnard's most important contribution with the band, and that is the very interesting question of the setlist. There are a few setlists out there of the period with Barnard, but of course this was all 50 years ago. These weren't big shows, so these are all what fans who were at the shows remember hearing, so it's all kind of up in the air a bit what exactly was played. But we do know that the average setlist tended to contain Happy the Man, Stagnation, The Light, The Knife, and two songs Barnard mentions in his interview that I'd never actually heard of. One called Wooden Mask, and another was an instrumental known as Moss. But the song that is of most interest and importance that was played live during this period is The Musical Box. The Musical Box was finalised and first performed live with Mick Barnard, with Mick himself writing several of the lead guitar parts. The Musical Box originated as a piece by Anthony Phillips and Mike Rutherford called F Sharp, before being fully developed and performed during Barnard's time with the band. Mick Barnard mentions in this interview that he was particularly interested in the Musical Box and trying to find the perfect fuzz guitar tones to complement the song and the band's sound. Now, Tony Banks has mentioned definitively that Mick wrote some of the lead guitar parts towards the end of the Musical Box, and Steve Hackett has said that he took Anthony Phillips and Mick Barnard's parts and combined them and added his own sections to make it the piece we hear on the album today. This really is quite incredible to think about, though, that Barnard's contribution helped make one of the classic Peter Gabriel-era Genesis songs, and that he is largely uncredited for his role in such a big song. But which part of the Musical Box did Barnard actually write? The actual solid details of exactly which part of the song he wrote is really up for debate. Apart from Banks and Hackett's claim that he wrote the end section, it's hard to tell exactly who came up with what part at what section. I mean, from about 5 minutes in when the guitar properly enters, there's so many kind of like lead parts scattered throughout, and it's hard to definitively state which parts Mick actually came up with. All we have to go off is several fan forums full of obscure threads dedicated to Mick Barnard, with many people who saw those show claiming that he wrote this bit and Banks played this bit live as a 4-piece. But again, these forums are from the early 2000s, and even then that was 30 years since Barnard was in the band, so it's all very, very up for debate. The general consensus among these forums is that Mick Barnard actually wrote the famous ending guitar solo. The harmonised solo at the end of the Musical Box was actually written by Mick Barnard, which, if true, is an absolutely phenomenal claim. Now, we know that he didn't write the harmony for the solo at the end of the Musical Box because Genesis had no studio time with Mick, so he had no chance of overdubbing sections and experimenting with things like that. But if that is true, then it's absolutely incredible that Mick Barnard created one of the most iconic guitar solos in all of prog rock and all of Genesis. And he's uncredited for it, barely anybody knows that he kind of did that bit. Barnard's important but rather brief tenure with the band sadly ended in the second week of January 1971 when he was quietly ousted in favour of Steve Hackett. Barnard was getting incredibly frustrated with the band and kept asking, well, am I officially in the band yet? But the band members were very cagey. The reason being is that while they were still performing and rehearsing with Barnard, they had already separately rehearsed with Steve Hackett and told Steve that he was definitively in the band. And at Barnard's last gig, it was the ultimate shame, as Barnard's old band, The Farm, were supporting Genesis, and after the show, Barnard was called over to the Genesis van, where he was told that he was no longer in the band and that they got a new guitarist. This must have been absolutely crushing, especially after coming up with something like the Musical Box in the band, just essentially being ousted after contributing to one of the most important songs in the group. Peter Gabriel and Mike Rutherford were incredibly apologetic towards Barnard, and Peter Gabriel made a real effort to kind of be like, yeah, this isn't really okay, this is a bit bad, we're really sorry about this. But after this, Steve Hackett was sworn in, and thus ended the short but very important Mick Barnard era of the band. In the interview, Mick talks about how Genesis was for him personally, with him stating, Peter Gabriel was very nice to me. Phil Collins I got on with, and I got on with Mike Rutherford. But Tony Banks, I couldn't ever get on with him. I was having real problems with him. Now, this isn't exactly new news, it's kind of a joke among Genesis fans that Tony Banks is known for being a little bit grumpy, and especially in the early days, Tony himself admits that he was impossible to work with, and if he didn't get his own way, he would storm out and have tantrums and things like that. So that bit is not a revelation, it's perfectly understandable. So what became of Mick Barnard after Genesis? Well, again, we come to another period with little to no information. As far as we know, he wasn't in any major bands after that, and he shortly afterwards became an audio engineer and got a job for Marshall Amps, working in research and development for 4 years before founding Bell Digital Audio, which stands for Barnard Electronics Limited. He went on to make mixing desks and outboard audio effects, including some which he actually custom made for the BBC to use, which I think is very, very interesting. So, is Mick Barnard the secret genius in Genesis whose contribution made them one of the greatest bands of all time? Or was he just a placeholder for a few months while Genesis promoted Trespass before Steve Hackett was found? I think the truth is perhaps somewhere between the two. I think he certainly was important to the band's early sound, you know. I mean, coming in after Anthony Phillips when the band wanted to quit, he gave them that confidence by playing with him of realising that they could continue and still be a band together and things like that. And without them finding Mick Barnard, it's possible that they would have just stopped completely and thought, we're never going to replace Ant, this is it, this is hopeless, and Genesis would be over forever and ever. So can we credit Mick Barnard with saving Genesis? Maybe not, but I'd like to think so. It'd be a nice little story if that was true. But I think everything kind of worked out as it was meant to be. Even Mick admits in this interview that he was not the finest guitar player in the world and that he did struggle with it. And of course, Steve Hackett created some of the most legendary songs with the band, so I think it all worked out for the best. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed joining me in the search for the lost Genesis member, Mick Barnard. This was really fun to research and put together, and I had a blast writing scripts for it and collecting all these tiny little fragments of information. I'd highly recommend Robin Platz's book Behind the Lines about Genesis. It's got so much kind of tiny little details in there. His goal was to write a book for the Genesis superfan full of information they didn't already know. And lots of things on there I've read that I won't sort of spoil now if you want to read the book that just isn't on the internet that really, really is fascinating. So I hope you've all enjoyed watching this video, and I hope to see you all again very soon.